Chapter 3. Abigail Reed glided effortlessly up the aisle of the church with her head slightly bowed. She trailed her parents by 2 steps and was flanked by her 2 sisters. This is my first memory of her. She was 13 years old. She was 6 months my elder. Over the months, my anticipation of her arrival at church began to grow. She made the hours of worship more bearable for me. For the next 2 years, I found myself stealing glances at Abigail every chance I got. I came to appreciate the ever-curious look in her deep brown eyes, the golden hue of her skin in the warm months, and the sharpness of her facial features. Over time, I memorized each of her expressions of emotion and truly believed I understood how she felt on our religious days by simply observing her from the room. There were times when Abigail glanced in my direction. I was never bold enough to hold her gaze. There was a perfection in her that made me content to just observe. The first time she spoke to me was so startling that I stammered over words of response for what seemed an eternity. She barely seemed to notice and instantly put me at ease with a patient smile. I realized later that she had sought out and seized an opportunity. My parents and brother had stopped to talk to others in the congregation, providing her with a chance to swoop in. "Another beautiful day the Lord has granted us with, Silas," she said softly. It certainly is glorious," fumbling for words as she peered gently into my eyes. "Will you be attending the husking bee tomorrow, Eve?" Abigail asked, referring to the community gathering planned to husk the large quantity of corn our community had recently harvested. The gathering would also include stories, songs, toy-making, and games when the work was complete. One of the rare occasions the adults in our community found it in their hearts to allow some fun. "I believe we will be going," I responded shyly, still in shock that she knew my name. Despite my habit of observing her, I knew her family was of wealth and never believed she would address someone from a family of our common position. Another aspect of the world we lived in that filled me with frustration and anger. We had strict rules to manage every part of our lives. "Perhaps we can share in some toy making for the children," she said confidently. There was sincerity in her eyes, but I couldn't help looking around to see if I was the victim of some type of prank. Before there was a chance to respond, she had silently drifted away. My parents and brother Micah were headed in my direction. Quickly surveying the area for signs of Abigail, I caught her glance briefly over her shoulder as she moved away. We locked eyes just long enough for me to know that her intent was genuine. This was the beginning of our secret friendship. Abigail Reed had a talent for surprise meetings. She materialized in various settings as if she were a spirit and disappeared just as supernaturally when any chance of discovery arose. It mattered not if we were at a public gathering or if I had stole away for a peaceful moment in one of my remote hiding places. I came to expect her appearance and company. In the beginning, our conversations were simple, but over time she became my most trusted friend. She put my soul at ease, and eventually I had a comfort in her presence that allowed me to share with her my most private thoughts. Mother had sent me to the Harwood's place to drop off a crate of candles from her recent labors. This was in exchange for the butter Goodwife Harwood would churn. This type of exchange was common in our community. I drifted through the Harwood's corn. The early summer growth was just over waist-high. My fingers brushed along the top of the stalks as I paused long enough to close my eyes and feel the gentle breeze blowing in my face and hear the rustling of leaves in the trees. The forest, freedom, lay just ahead. There were precious few moments of time away from the pressure to act perfect and be perfect. Just a 5-minute walk from the cornfield stood 2 oaks I had discovered that seemed to embrace, creating a raised perch as comfortable as any sailor's hammock. I ran forward, knowing that I would be missed if my absence went on too long. I set the crate at the edge of the field and burst through the trees, letting the coolness engulf me. I took a deep breath and walked silently toward the intertwined oaks. As I approached, 2 feet dangled from the raised area in the trees. "What took you so long?" Abigail teased. "One would think I have no chores to complete the way you plod along." "Would you like to join me for a walk, miss?" I offered with a hand extended to help her down from the perch. Abigail grabbed my hand and hopped down. I caught her just above the hips and returned her softly to the forest floor. Abigail gave a shy smile with slightly flushed cheeks as she skipped 2 steps ahead and proceeded further into the forest. After catching up, we walked carefully onward like many times before, wondering what treasures and memories the woods would provide. We walked along, talking, joking, and experiencing the world together away from rules and traditions. Every time our arms or shoulders brushed together, my heart beat faster and my desire to express how I felt grew. My fear of losing these moments held me in check. Abigail froze next to me as she extended her arms, slowly pointing. She leaned in close and her cheek rested against mine. A short distance ahead in the forest was a doe and her 2 young fawns basking in a sunlit grassy clearing. Ears and tails flickered as they bent forward, grazing, and once in a while, cautiously, each surveyed their surroundings. I could smell Abigail's skin and feel the warmth of her cheek. Her curls scratched softly against my face, and our bodies supported one another. I stayed as still as possible. I was afraid to let this moment end. The deer caught a scent, probably ours, and quickly bounded away. Abigail backed slowly away. "The time has gotten away," she said cheerily as she turned and bounded away just as quickly as the doe and her fawns had moments earlier. Constantly trying to free up time in hopes that Abigail would appear hurt my relationship with my father. Every time I was sent to pick something up in town or went to a neighbor's to drop something off or ask a favor, I would steal away. When my father questioned me, I had no choice but to lie. I could not risk losing my time with Abigail and had no idea how my father would react if he knew about her. He knew I was not truthful with him. His frustration continued to grow, and I was growing too old for him to correct me with a wooden switch. There were times my brother Micah clumsily followed me. I assumed my father sent him to watch and report on my actions. On those days, I simply completed my task and returned home promptly. I sometimes considered telling my mother about Abigail. Without a doubt, she would eventually tell my father. It was her duty and responsibility as a wife to do so. She was a good wife to my father. I never realized then how big of a problem I was becoming. My brother and I attended school whenever possible in a small, cramped, one-room schoolhouse in town. Schoolmaster Wood was strict, but he appeared to love to teach us. Like the rest of our world, his was filled with rules also. Education was designed to teach us the 3 R's, reading, writing, arithmetic, while shaping our morals and values through religious messages in most lessons. Community leaders frequently stopped in to watch part of the lessons. Schoolmaster Wood seemed very nervous on these occasions. My classmates acted mostly like miniature adults, constantly reminding each other of the rules and clarifying whose position in society was higher. Abigail and her sisters were educated at home by their mother. I didn't try to make friends. Micah spent outside time with Abel Milton and Jacob Guthrie. This became my group as well. Most of the time we spent together, I listened to them talk. They alternated between playing games and having conversations about girls in our community. They rarely found fault with anything in our lives. I never mentioned Abigail. Most of the time I spoke, it was to ask questions to clarify their views on parts of our life. Why are there some girls we can't marry? Why is it a sin to hurt others, but not a sin to rule the child and whip sinners? Why does God speak to Reverend Washburn as he claims, but never to us? How can a thought be a sin if you don't act on the thought? They mostly seemed annoyed by my questions. My anger toward Father and the prying members of our community was growing in me like an intense flame. I had nearly reached my 16th year and was expected to be a man in my work responsibilities and community obligations, but I had to mask my emotions and hide my feelings like a scared child. The many questions I shared and discussed with Abigail about my frustration with our community began to turn to criticism and hatred. Abigail, my trusted confidant, had never hesitated to engage in discussions about our families, religion, community values, and anything else that I dreamed up. She had an even approach to such topics, but seemed to admire and embrace any question I put forth. She was brilliant at seeing all of the perspectives in every situation. She would often insist that I recognize how my father, or anyone else we were discussing, saw the situation. It was extraordinary how she could see events in a completely unbiased way. Her approach rarely solved a problem, but it always left me thinking more deeply about the problem or issue. She simply brought brightness to any gloom and made me appreciate the moment we were in, rather than obsessing about issues or problems that were beyond my control. There was a stagnant pond hidden by a thick patch of blackberry bushes just outside of town. Through the thicket, there was a gap that could be accessed by sliding between two old oak trees. This became our favorite meeting place. Abigail's father was a lumber trade merchant and had both a building and home in town. Over time, I realized this was the place where she magically materialized most often. There was a soft scratch of twigs behind me as I skipped a stone across the murky pond water. It was a crisp spring day, so the insects were not very bothersome. Abigail shuffled into the clearing with her hands clasped in front of her. Her brown curly hair framed her beautiful face as she batted her eyes jokingly, pretending to be flirting. She smiled as she began. "You certainly are dashing today, Mr. Freethorn," she teased. "If only I could focus on the things of this world that brings me happiness. Perhaps then I could be dashing like the heroes of our books," I responded thoughtfully. "I cannot help but declare, Silas, that the older you grow, the more glum you become. What troubles you so much that your eternal happiness is in doubt today? Yours is a good family and good standing in the community. Your mother is kind, only your father is like a thorn in your side. I say mend it, Silas. You have told me yourself many times that you struggle to find common ground. Use some of the wit and charm you use with me to improve relations with your father." "I admit that father is the central problem," I hesitated before continuing, "but it is the whole community, the rules, the way people condemn others, the unequal treatment, all while they march around with noses in the air like they are better people than everyone else. Even as children we have watched whippings and been encouraged to throw objects at criminals detained for public humiliation. Do you not see that we are a band of hypocrites? We claim to be a righteous and chosen people, but our leaders act as if they are God himself. We are all prisoners. I cannot be me or be honest about my inner feelings in this community out of fear. It makes me sick." I spat for effect. Abigail did not respond for a long time. She looked down and appeared to be considering her next words carefully. Through all of our years of meetings and friendship, I had never spoken this frankly about my anger and dislike of our community. We often discussed our families and events that had occurred. We even hinted occasionally about feelings for one another, but nothing nearly as bold and blasphemous as what I had just said. When she finally looked up, there was a look of deep concern in her eyes. She finally began to speak. "I need you to try and fix things with your father. If you're too stubborn to give in, well then, do it for me. The words you spoke just now are dangerous words, and I know that you understand the consequences others have faced for the same. I beg you to soften your stance and see the good around you and the possibilities that exist with time and patience." With that, she spun and headed back toward the brush without waiting for a response. Just before she entered the gap between the thorny bushes, she hesitated and said coyly, "I have plans for you yet, Silas Freethorn," as if she sensed the sinking feeling in my stomach her sudden departure had given me.